Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Farnam Street podcast called The Knowledge Project. I'm your host, Shane Parrish, the curator behind the Farnam Street blog, which is an online community focused on mastering the best of what other people have already figured out. The Knowledge Project is where we talk with interesting people to uncover the frameworks that you can use to learn more in less time, make better decisions, and live a happier, more meaningful life. On this episode, I have Mauboussin. Michael is one of my favorite people to talk with. This dude is a true polymath. He's the director of research at Blue Mountain Capital Management. Prior to that, he was the head of global financial strategies at Credit Suisse and the chief investment strategist at Legg Mason Capital Management. He's also the author of 3 books, including one of my favorite multidisciplinary reads, More Than You Know, Finding Financial Wisdom in Unconventional Places. As you'll see, when the two of us get together, we geek out over decision making. This conversation will not disappoint. You were the first podcast guest we ever had on the Knowledge Project, which was almost 2.5 years ago. Bring me up to date. What have you been working on in the last few years since we chatted last?
Well, Shane, I think it's a lot of the same stuff. And really what I've been trying to do is deepen some of the themes that we've been working on. Just a couple examples. One, I think we talked briefly about some of Kahneman's work on the inside versus the outside view and really the application of base rates to improve the quality of forecast and decision making. And in that regard, we've really tried to do some deep dives, especially in corporate performance, to understand a large sweep of history in terms of corporate performance for sales growth and gross profitability, earnings growth, and so forth. Some of the more recent stuff I've been working on that's fun, I've been doing a lot of research on the concept of comparing things. And it turns out, right, comparison is actually something that comes quite naturally to us as humans. It's been a deep study of cognitive psychology for decades. But not surprisingly, we're not very good at it. So that's another area where I've been doing a really big deep dive. But more of the same, a lot of work on decision making. But again, thinking about the sweep of things from how are markets efficient or inefficient, thinking a lot about still issues around valuation, and thinking a lot about what makes for a good business and sustainable competitive advantage.
Where have you landed on with base rates? And talk to me about a little bit of the nuances that you've come up with in terms of how you apply them to make more effective decisions. Yeah,
it's really super. So just to take one step back, the concept here relates to a notion that Danny Kahneman popularized, but it's been around for a while, and he calls it the inside versus the outside view. So the inside view basically says if I present a problem to you, the way we all tend to cope with it is to gather lots of information, to combine it with our own experience and inputs, and then we project into the future. And almost all problems, we deal with in that fashion. And what psychologists have come along and said is, what you should probably do is start with something called a base rate, and basically asking the question, what happened when other people were in this situation before? And I should mention, it's not a natural way to think, right? Because you have to find the base rate and defer to it, and you have to sort of leave aside your own experience and inputs, and we all are sort of slow to discount our own views of the world. So that's the basic idea, and I think there are a couple things that come out of this that are extremely rich. The first is how you should weight the inside versus the outside view. And the basic heuristic on this is that if there's a lot of luck, a lot of randomness, you should rely exclusively or almost exclusively on the base rate. If there's a lot of skill, you should rely almost exclusively on the inside view, right, on your own experience. And actually, most activities in life are between those two extremes, and so you should blend the two in some appropriate measure. Now, what this introduces immediately, if you think about it for a moment, is a framework for not only understanding regression toward the mean, but also quantifying regression toward the mean. You go talk to the investment community, even like in athletics, everybody understands the notion, at least at a high level, of regression toward the mean, but very few people know how to operationalize it. And this actually lays out a very specific framework for operationalizing it. Let me just give you one kind of example to try to make it slightly more concrete. In corporate performance, two measures that are very common for people to look at are sales growth rates and earnings growth rates. And it turns out that sales growth rates are a lot more persistent, so you might say more indicative of some sort of underlying skill, perhaps related to the industry and so forth. And hence, they're much more predictable. So you don't have to regress growth rates as much as earnings, which themselves are actually not quite random, but quite close to random, where regression happens really, really quickly. So to me, it's first trying to get your arms around the idea of base rates, identifying the data, but then understanding how to intelligently integrate the inside the outside view. And again, with this eye to really understanding, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively.
How do I find out where I am on this luck, randomness, skill continuum? I mean, as a knowledge worker, I would think that I'm prone to believe, maybe over-exaggerate the skill that I'm bringing to the table, and thus I would discount the base rate and favor my own skill.
Right, exactly. So there's a whole range of approaches to doing this. I'll mention that there is a statistical method. So I'll start with something that makes my life easy to explain, but a statistical method to do that. And it's based on a formulation in statistics that can be very useful. And this formulation that says that the standard deviation of independent distribution A squared plus the standard deviation of independent distribution B squared equals the standard deviation squared of A plus B. So basically, it's called like the Pythagorean theorem of statistics. You say, all right, what the heck do I do with that? And the answer is you can apply this, for example, to professional sports leagues. So let's take it as example, say the NBA, National Basketball Association. And you say, all right, well, how would I apply this formula? Well, you actually know what the standard deviation or the variance is of the win-loss records of all the teams in the NBA. So that is a known. And then you also can estimate through binomial distribution what the league would look like if it were totally dictated by luck, right? So instead of the teams actually playing, they just flipped a coin, right? So by inference, you can then back into the variance of skill and see how much skill contributes to the outcomes. And, by the way, you can rank professional sports leagues on this. And not surprisingly, probably the NBA is the most, let me say it more carefully, the NBA is the sport that's furthest from randomness, furthest from pure luck configuration. And sports like actually ice hockey and baseball are actually quite much closer to being random. So that's one thing. Now you might say, hey, as a knowledge worker, I can't, I'm not getting win-loss records and so forth. There are some other things you can do as well. One example is, how predictable is your field? How good are experts at anticipating particular outcomes? How much do experts agree? Because usually if there's a lot of skill or a lot of, very little luck or randomness, experts will come to the same conclusion about similar topics. So there's some other more qualitative ways to do that, but those would be some of the things to think about. And I'll also say one more thing that's really interesting about organizations. This is my observation. I don't know that I can prove this, but my observation would be usually when you're a lower level worker, your job actually tends to have a higher skill component, right? So you're doing something, you're an accounts receivable clerk and you're collecting accounts receivables, right? We can measure what we're doing. It's pretty much skill based. But as you move up through the organization, it's not uncommon for the frequency, the types of decisions you make to go down, but the importance of the decisions to go up, and also the luck of the outcomes related to those decisions to go up. What's also ironic, of course, is the remuneration tends to be higher the higher you are in the organization. So CEOs are often making fewer sort of big consequential decisions than people below them. They are paid more, but also those decisions tend to be more luck laden, which is really interesting. So sort of a funny thought about how organizations can work.
This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
If you're a QuickBooks customer looking to grow without the growing pains, you need the Intuit ERP, the AI native ERP that upgrades right from QuickBooks. Learn more at intuit.com/ERP.
Is there also a bigger variance in the types of decisions that you're making?
At the high end?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suspect that's the case, right? Because conceptually, at least someone who is a CEO is making decisions really about resource allocation, and that would be, financial resources, human resources, and so forth. So yeah, I suspect there is a lot more variance as you move up. Which is all really super interesting. And the question is, are the what you learn at lower levels, or as you grow up in an organization, are those things applicable as you get to that senior job? So these are all super interesting questions.
So when you're thinking about organizations making decisions, or maybe senior managers or CEOs, do you find that there's often a process involved in those decisions?
I think it runs the gamut. One of the things that I've always found to be fascinating and actually somewhat disconcerting is that many executives will say that and by the way, majority of executives will say that they rely or lean on their intuitions for making their decisions, right? And, the definition of an intuition is sort of a sense of what you should do or a view of things without really tapping your conscious thinking. And if that's the case, that to me would suggest that there's much more that we can do to improve. That said, in other fields, for example, money management, the business that I've been associated with, you sort of learn to, over time, think about, distributions of outcomes and the probabilities attached to those distributions, and really trying to think sort of more of an expected value type of framework. So I think it runs the gamut. But clearly, I think that with a lot of the work by Kahneman and Tversky, and of course Dick Thaler winning the Nobel Prize a few weeks ago, has put into sharper focus some of the virtues of thinking about decisions more systematically, and trying to address or remove some of the biases.
So how would you advise me hypothetically if I had a company, we're a Fortune 500 company, we don't really have a decision-making process. How do we put one in place? What does that look like? And how do we use that to get better over time?
Right, exactly. So, there's the overarching theme here would be whether and by the way, we should acknowledge at the outset that there's probably a continuum of decision types, some of which are very simple, cut and dried, and there are probably right or close to right answers, and there are wrong answers, and other decisions that are inherently probabilistic and harder to, right? I will say that, so I think the broad concept would be, are there ways that we can be systematic in evaluating the goodness of a particular decision, right? So by goodness, you need to really think about two things. One is, what are the inputs, and what are the measures by which we judge this, right? So in certain applications, that's pretty straightforward. For a company, it might be, creating value. It might be for a portfolio manager in investing, it would be creating a more attractive portfolio. But you need sort of good inputs and some measure of goodness. Now, one of the things, and the key is to try to be as systematic about that as possible, and in a sense, write down. So one of the things that's really captured my imagination since we have spoken last was this article published about a year ago by Danny Kahneman and some of his colleagues on noise in the Harvard Business Review. Did you see that article? Do you know that article?
No, I don't think so.
So here's the basic idea. Kahneman obviously is renowned for, and renowned for his work on heuristics and biases. This idea that we go through life with rules of thumb that are incredibly time-saving and by and large pretty accurate, come with inherent biases that lead to suboptimal decisions. So that's fine, and hopefully everyone's got the memo on that. This newer work actually is a somewhat different ilk, and he says, I should probably give an example of this. So they went to a large insurance company. And, and these firms typically have, for example, insurance adjusters, people who will settle your claim if you make a claim. And, they're trained the same way. They have the same software. Basically, you should expect that maybe not perfectly interchangeable, but these folks should be basically doing similar jobs, similar tasks, and should have similar outcomes. And so what they did is they gave these people a claim, a set of facts, and they first went to their managers and they said, hey, how much variance do you expect in these outcomes, right? Again, trained the same way, same software, and so forth. And the manager said, a priori, 5 to 10% variance. Some people have good days, some people have bad days, right? But there'll be a little bit of variance, but pretty tight, right, for the most part. When they got the numbers back, they found the variance between 40 and 60%. So people were just completely inconsistent in applying the basic rules and the basic algorithm. So economists come to call this noise, and it's this basic idea that even when there are systematic ways to do things, as humans, we often don't stick to the script, and there's a huge amount of variation. So that would be something I would really want to examine in an organization, and that's from top to bottom, is if there are systematic processes that make sense for different levels of decision making, can we identify those? Can we articulate those? And now, perhaps most importantly, can we make sure that our employees hew to those? There is a series of papers that came out of Wharton that I thought were awesome about algorithm aversion. You may have seen these. And the basic idea was that as human beings, we tend to be quite adverse to sticking to a simple algorithm. And in fact, the algorithm goes wrong, we get very upset and are very dismissive. And it turns out, they said, there's a way to overcome this, which I think makes enormous amounts of sense. And they said the way you overcome this is you say to people, your first answer is going to be what the algorithm tells you, right? Just apply the algorithm. And then will allow you to introduce a little bit of judgment. You can tweak the response. They said that doesn't matter how much you let them tweak it. They can tweak it just a tiny amount, but you can tweak the response. So then there's a sense of volition that the human's involved in some way, shape, or form, but you do stick closer to what is ultimately a better solution. So this idea of algorithm aversion and being systematic, I think that would be the approach that I would try to take if I were starting with a clean sheet of paper in any organization.
What sort of things would you incorporate into that process? Would you have a checklist, sort of that level of formulaic, systematic process where, like, what are the base rates? Or would you have more intuition-based, where people are feeling, but the process is generalized but outlined, but you kind of feel your way through it?
Yeah, I think that, well, you probably know where I'm going to come down on this, but it depends a little bit on the activity. But I think checklists are really powerful, and checklists are mostly, I think that most people don't like checklists because they feel strained to some degree. But what a checklist does is compels you to make sure that you've covered all your bases. And certainly the lessons we've learned in medicine for checklists have been extremely powerful, and certainly I think that the applications should go beyond that. Now, intuition, I think we've talked about intuition before, but I think the key to intuition is that it exists, it can be very powerful, but we have to be very careful about where it applies. And I think the general rule is intuition can be developed in realms that are stable and linear. So if there's a repeated pattern and things don't change that much, you can train your intuition. You have to train it, but you can train your intuition. It can be very powerful. So, the canonical examples, obviously chess players and, grandmasters are amazing. Their ability to chunk, their ability to see what's going on quite rapidly. But, it should be noted that it's not some superpower force of these grandmasters. If you change the rules of chess or change the size of the board, all bets would be off and they'd be back to square one. So, yeah, as you know, I probably tend toward the more structured. Now, all that said, right, you need, there are many things in life that do change over time, so they evolve over time. So you got to be careful about getting too rigid and having a mismatch between your decision processes and the environment. So there is that blend as well.
Let's talk about intuition for 1 second there. How do we develop intuition? I'm thinking about myself in the context of working for an organization, and I have all of these people around me who might be domain experts, and they have really good intuition in their particular domain. how do I acquire a better knowledge of that domain? So how do I improve my intuition in other people's domains?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Once again, I think that there's just some great quotes on this that just because you've been doing something for a long time doesn't mean you're an expert, right? So I think we should first be very I don't know if skeptical is the right word, but we should just be careful about suggesting people have domain or don't have domain expertise. That said, to me, again, there are sort of two conditions. By the way, there's a great paper written by Danny Kahneman and Gary Klein in 2009, and the history was really interesting because Kahneman was obviously of the belief that people can be suboptimal in their decision making or they have these biases, and Klein was sort of celebrated the notion of intuition and how intuition can work. And they're both very thoughtful, respectful guys, and they said maybe we should try to work together on something and see if we can find some common ground. And I think the common ground that they came to, which I think makes sense, is that intuition applies, or expertise applies, when you have this sort of stable regularity in the domain itself, and where you're trained with really quality feedback and accurate feedback. So I think it's those two dimensions: is A, it's going to be to some degree domain specific, and B, it requires training, and that goes back to the Anders Ericsson work on I don't say 10,000 hours, but basically deliberate practice, right? So deliberate practice being at the boundary of your capabilities with quality and accurate feedback to improve. So can you sort of look over somebody else's shoulder and acquire their domain expertise? I think the answer is actually probably not, unless you are willing to dedicate some amount of time to getting trained and through deliberate practice, which is a non-trivial thing. So, it's interesting. And again, the degree to which you should rely on others also is a degree to which, again, those two characteristics have been satisfied, right? That's a fairly stable domain and they've been trained effectively.
I want to dive into that for 1 second. I mean, we improve through deliberate practice. Someone who can't run a few miles can work at it and get a little bit better. There's this feedback loop going on, but I want to talk about knowledge workers. Say I'm a manager, maybe a portfolio manager, maybe a people manager in an organization. Let's also say I'm above average in my performance, but I hit a rut and all of a sudden my performance is worse than normal. I'm underperforming. This is normal. It's natural. I mean, it happens, but at the same time, I feel smarter and better because I'm always learning. But history is replete with people like me being stubborn or lacking humility and missing a big change. How do I know I'm not one of these people? Like, how do you measure whether you're in a typical trend or you've lost the skill advantage? In his book, Ed Thorpe talked about card playing and how he hit a rut, but as long as he was consistent with the odds, he knew he was fine because cards are a physical system, but managing people is more of a biological system. So this type of analysis isn't as relevant. How would you kind of advise me?
Yeah, so Shane, it's such I don't know really what the answer to that is, but it is an interesting, and I think a little bit of what Thorpe was saying, would apply, or some of those lessons might apply. And, I think one of the observations we can make is if you are operating in this completely skilled, dominated domain, outcomes are all you really need to know about, right? And so to your point, if you're performing well or performing poorly, that's almost a pure reflection of your skill. And in those domains, it's easy. But as you get into things that are more, as you mentioned, maybe luck-laden or biological, so they're going to be much messier, you do have to go back and default to understanding the process and, with some sort of faith that a good process will ultimately lead to good outcomes. So the simpler case in that realm would be the Thorpe story, right, where that you're making bets with a probability, and there can be stretches where you just have bad luck, even though you're making the right decisions in your process. But when you talk about managing people, it becomes altogether that much more difficult, right? Because we don't really know exactly how the system is, and it's certainly not a physical system. So, part of that would be, to me, is to think about or revisit your process periodically. And again, one of the important ingredients to improving process over time is trying to get feedback. And the challenge is, I think, that the thing you're trying to manage, the thing you're trying to game you're playing, let's say it that way, the rules can change, and as a consequence, you have to probably evolve. And a great example of that is in markets, where markets, as a market practitioner, you have to be very process oriented, but so that means that there are some elements of markets that are immutable, some principles that probably carry throughout any environment. But there are a lot of ideas that are mutable, that change and evolve. I mean, our economy evolves, the characters evolve, relationships between nations evolve, and those are things you just have to take into consideration. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that at all, but I do think you have to be very process oriented, and you have to think about the domain, whether that's changing. And you have to think about trying to gather and implement whatever feedback you get to make sure that you're aligned with what will lead to success in your domain.
I'm curious about your take on the concept of invariant strategies or invariant ideas, something that never steers you wrong no matter the environmental changes, sort of a go-to, always on by default. Do you have any of these in your head, whether it's life or business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I think about, I would just step back and just think about evolution and what is evolution trying to do, and really, and it goes back to Dawkins, right? I mean, it's propagation of genes to some degree, so it's basically living to see another day and living, basically, right? So strategies to propagate certainly would be a big one for that. In money management, there probably would be a few things that are really important. One is, and I would say close to immutable, if not immutable. One is that the value of usually a business, but really a financial asset, is the present value of the cash that it generates. And, it's hard to get away from that ultimately being the case. And that has always been true, and I think it will always be true going forward. Second is, while it's extremely difficult to characterize, there should be a general relationship. Is the surer something is, the less you get paid to bet on it, and the less sure it is, the more you get paid to bet on it. And the very simple metaphor is the horse race, the track. So the favorite should get paid less if you bet on the favorite than the long shot, and that's probably pretty close to immutable. So though there are some of those principles like that. So again, evolution is a big one. But again, the cast of characters tends to change. The circumstances tend to change. So how you would evaluate those things might change quite a bit. And you think about from an evolutionary point of view, right? There are some ecosystems that are extremely stable that encourage a certain kind of ecosystem development, and then there are other ecosystems that change really rapidly. And what allows for success and propagation in that environment could be quite different, right? And this all ties back to things like how much as an organization or even as a species you should trade off between exploitation, which is basically doing the same thing you've always done and taking advantage of it, and exploration, which is seeking new domains, new ideas, and so forth. And those trade-offs, again, probably conditional on the rate of change in the environment, but that idea of how much you need to explore, how much you need to spend on R&D, that's also probably something that you could see almost everywhere you look.
How do you determine the rate of change in your environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm sure there's an ecological answer to that that's much more rigorous than anything I could come up with. But yeah, I mean, I think that, for example, in the world of business, in the world of business, I think there are some things that we can do to try to measure that. I'll mention some of the tests that we use that may be useful. One is straight up entry and exit data. So you're looking at a particular industry, and the question you want to pose is how many companies come into it, how many companies leave, and all things being equal, higher entry and exit would be a less stable, more changing. We look at a measure called market share change. So we look at all the participants over some period of time, say 3 years or 5 years, and then we look at the absolute average market share change, right? So whether you've lost or gained, it becomes a positive number. We look at that average. And all things being equal, if that number is higher, that means there's a lot of market share moving around. If that number is low, that means it's relatively stable. So that's another rough proxy for it. The third thing we do is we look at something called profit pools, which is, basically a breakdown of how much each company makes, and we see how that changes over time. So those, at least in the world of business, those might be some high-level proxies for basically the rate of change that can be pretty helpful heuristics. And again, you don't want to pay for a huge amount of competitive advantage in an industry where there's a ton of entry and exit, where market shares are very volatile. And by contrast, you might be much more willing to pay for franchise value for an industry where market shares are very stable, where entrants and exits are very scarce, and so forth, right? So that would be from a corporate point of view, might be one way to think about that.
How have your thoughts on algorithmic kind of decision making progressed over time? Last time we talked, I think we talked a little bit about AI, and I think you called it the expert squeeze. Where are you on that these days? Do you think AI is going to take over ground more quickly, or perhaps less quickly than most people think?
I think it's incredible. It's incredibly wide open. I think that we can continue as societies to continue to apply more of these kinds of concepts. So there's applicability, but all this also gives me a little bit of pause. And I guess the thing that concerns me the most, if you can imagine almost like a little 3x3 grid, and in the various columns you would put, business, government, and academia. And then in the rows, you might put something like, access to resources, access to data, and then maybe incentives, right? Those three rows. And then just fill them out in a way that you think would make sense. And I think if you do that, what you probably would find is the access to resources and the access to data is probably greatest among a certain handful of businesses, companies, actually. And those are companies you can probably name right off the top of your head. And then the question is, what are the incentives? And whereas in academia, the incentive might be, to write some really cool paper and to get citations and so forth. In government, it might be to obviously try to govern effectively and do the best for the most people. For business, the incentives might be sell more ads, get more people to click on my page, right? Something like that. And those might not be, there's a question as to whether those are ultimately great societal good. So that to me is something that gives me a little bit of pause in all this. The second thing I'll just say in general, because I come at the world from the point of view of markets, and there are areas where applications of algorithms are incredibly effective. Again, goes back to these sort of more stable environments or predictive environments. But you have to be very, very careful about systems that are changing. The fancy term for it's non-stationarity. So the statistical properties of the underlying systems change over time. And that's another concern I might have. And we see it a little bit of this in finance. It's this concept of overfitting, right? So you have these data, you can match history beautifully, but you fail to anticipate that the world itself is dynamic. And so the rules that worked in the past may not work in the future. So, overall, I would say probably I'm a technology enthusiast. I tend to be an optimist, rightly or wrongly. But there are some aspects of all this that give me pause. And, this idea of the incentives, who's got the resources, data, and what are their incentives, I guess is the thing that gives me the most concern overall.
Do you think we ever end up in a situation where the data just becomes this insurmountable advantage?
Yeah, we may be there already. I don't know. You think about the amount of data that some of these large technology companies have. The ones that come right to mind, of course, would be Google and Facebook and Amazon.com. It's staggering, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of slowdown in the momentum of a lot of those businesses. Now, broadly, those things generate huge amounts of value, right, for a consumer. For Google, gives you a huge amount of value. I don't know that I could go through a day without deferring to my Google searches, which I use all the time. Amazon, great value. Facebook, societal value. So there are a lot of good things with this, but again, the amount of data that they can capture, and because all those companies have substantial resources, they can put a lot of resources against not only capturing but analyzing this data. Yeah, it's an interesting flywheel, right?
Do you think that that should be a public good? Like maybe hypothetically, these companies should be forced to release data that's anything over 6 months old, so we can encourage people to compete?
I've never thought about that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I probably would be inclined to think that's not a bad idea, but I just haven't thought about that. I don't know.
Let's go back to your work on you're on the Santa Fe Institute. You're the head of the board of trustees. How did you originally get involved with complexity research?
So in the mid 1990s, I went to a Baltimore Orioles baseball game, and my host was Bill Miller, who preceded me as chair of the board. And Bill is a very interesting guy, very eclectic reader, and he had read a bunch of articles and had been out to the Santa Fe Institute and said, this might be a place that would have an appeal for you. I ended up working with Bill a few years after that. And at the time, I was reading a lot. I was just reading a lot, but I was reading in particular a lot of science and biology and evolution. And I was very keen to understand the intersection between economics and biology. I was also doing a lot of work on, competitive advantage. And in particular, the theory that got me sort of first roped in was work done by Brian Arthur, who ran the first economics program at SFI. And Brian has this idea of something called increasing returns. So we're taught in economics, microeconomics, and by the way, still largely true, that returns on incremental capital tend to migrate toward the cost of capital. And typically the reason for that is competition, right? If you're generating, Shane, massive excess returns, I'm going to come in and compete with you and whittle those away eventually over time. Brian laid out a situation, a set of circumstances where returns actually may not regress toward the mean. They may actually be repulsed from the mean, increasing returns. And it was a sort of a heretical thought in the world of economics, right? He was sort of shunned a little bit for this point of view. But it was based on a lot of this, what now seems to be more mainstream, but at the time very nascent work on networks and network effects and those kinds of concepts. So I went out there in probably a little more than 20 years ago, and from the very first meeting there was enthralled, the whole thing. And as you probably know, SFI was founded in the mid-1980s by a slew of very prominent scientists, many of which had Nobel Prizes, who felt that much of academia had become siloed. And so people were speaking to one another within disciplines, but that many of the most important and vexing issues that our scientific and really our world face were at the intersections of disciplines. So it was set up as an institute that was meant to break down disciplinary borders and have people of different disciplines speak with one another about problems that are common. And the unifying theme, if there is one, is the study of complex systems. And complex systems, I think we can articulate fairly simply, which is, independent agents, which could be, neurons in your brain or people in the city of New York or, ants in an ant colony, allowing them to interact with one another and observing and understanding the systems that emerge from that interaction. And so absolutely fascinating stuff. And I've learned so many important lessons, both that apply both to science and also the world of business. But perhaps most importantly, for me at least, it's an extraordinary community in the sense of massive self-selection for people who are intellectually voracious, willing to go across intellectual boundaries, just minds wide open, which is really fantastic. So we actually have our board meeting coming up this weekend. It's the beginning of November. And I'm really always excited to go out there. And we're going to be talking actually about intelligence and the application of intelligence as one of our themes. So, very, very influential, continues to be very influential. And in my 20 years of involvement, it's been a really important contributor to my intellectual development.
You do so much. So you're on the board, you have a full-time career in finance, you're a prolific kind of author and researcher. How do you balance all of these different demands?
It doesn't feel like I do very much, actually. There's nothing magical about it. I think that as the nature of the work that I've been able to do over the years, I've been blessed with the opportunity to allocate a fair bit of time doing research and being able to write. And it's really fun for me. I like to think about it as input and output, and that's, by the way, really the essence, I think, of teaching or quality teaching. So I've been able to have this balance between learning about things and inputting, and especially being able to follow a little bit of what I find to be interesting, and then output, which is communicating it, certainly within our organization first, but also and more broadly.
When it's time to scale your business, it's time for Shopify. Get everything you need to grow the way you want, like all the way. Stack more sales with the best converting checkout on the planet. Track your cha-chings from every channel, right in one spot. And turn real-time reporting into big-time opportunities. Take your business to a whole new level. Switch to Shopify. Start your free trial today.
Adobe Firefly is the all-in-one creative studio with AI-powered image and video editing for today's creative process. Built for creators of every kind, Firefly helps you generate, edit, and experiment fast. Because the asks aren't getting smaller, the budgets aren't getting bigger, and the timelines, oh yeah, still tight. With all the best creative AI models in one place, Firefly brings your ideas to life. Unlock a better way to make with Adobe Firefly.
And, I'm a big believer that the notion of synthesis and being able to write and speak reasonably intelligently on something is actually an indication of understanding, or first step toward understanding, let's say it that way. And I just had this sort of lucky ability or life that I've been able to pursue some of these things. I think, Shane, we may have talked about this before, but I think it's also important to always recognize, and I think this is true for you as well, so I can't speak on your behalf, but I think I'll speak on your behalf, which is, a lot of it's time allocation. And whereas I really enjoy reading books, I get a lot from it, I spend a lot of time doing it, that's I'm not watching TV much, right? If you talk to me about popular TV show series or something, I don't know what's going on, and that's not great. I mean, they're Game of Thrones. I've never seen an episode of Game of Thrones. I don't know about it. So, not that I'm proud of that, but that's a trade-off that I've decided to make. So, when you focus on sort of the output results, it's important to acknowledge that there are some things there are many deficiencies that should also be underscored.
I've never seen an episode of Game of Thrones either. So I think we're in the same boat there. Do you think in all the opportunities that you get, do you think about them from an opportunity cost lens? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I do a little bit. I mean, I think that, as you know, time is really our most scarce resource. And so trying to be thoughtful about allocation of time is always useful. But to some degree, and again, part of it is just I've been very lucky in my career and who I've been able to work with. In some degree, there's been a remarkable overlap between the kinds of things that I'm interested in and the kinds of things that I can actually do from a professional point of view, less legitimately, right? So to me, that's really been a lifesaver. So it's not like and by the way, even all the stuff that I read outside of work, I can't ever view that as separate from my work, right? So basically, everything that goes into this mix is part of the overall thinking and part of the overall output. So, yeah, I mean, and when we say opportunity cost, right? So, like not watching Game of Thrones is probably an opportunity cost. That's a trade-off I'd be willing to make. But I also think it's not. These are, it's not for everybody. And the way I live my life is not for everybody. So just always want to be clear about that. There's no claim of superiority or anything like that.
I think we might be the only two people on the planet who've never watched Game of Thrones, and we're talking to each other right now.
Exactly.
You're a prolific reader. I have a lot of reading questions for you. I mean, I have to ask, of course, what are a few of the best books you've read since we've chatted last? Are there any that you've changed your mind on significantly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even this year I've really found a few books to be really terrific. Over the summer, and by the way, I think and I always forewarn people on this, I think it's a very big commitment, but over the summer I spent a lot of time reading Robert Sapolsky's new book, Behave. And did you read that, by the way?
I haven't read it yet. I did a skim of it already, but
Yeah. So I think Behave is, I don't want to be too hyperbolic about it, but I think it's probably the best book I've ever read on human behavior. And, Sapolsky himself is obviously a really terrific scholar, but he's a brilliant communicator as well. It's a slog, though. It's 700 pages, and it's a lot of work, and it requires some commitment. But it starts really with neuroscience and goes everywhere from, the neuroscience up to culture and basically everything in between. And I think when you read a book like that, when you put that down and really contemplate it, it makes you really circumspect about a lot of things, about people's behaviors, about your own behaviors, how we fit in as societies, and so forth. So Sapolsky's book Behave, I thought was epic, and again, it's not something you can just dip in and dip out of. What I would recommend is someone goes away on holiday or whatever, is to allocate a couple hours a day for a week or so and really get into it. Earlier this year, one of my Santa Fe Institute colleagues, Jeffrey West, published a book called Scale. I find this work to be among the most wondrous research I've ever seen. The principle of scale is there's a relationship that's been well understood in biology for a long time, which is if you plot the mass and metabolic rates, so basically mass and energy usage of, let's just use something simple, say mammals, and you do it on a logarithmic scale. So that's the key is not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but rather logarithmic means that each tick mark is the same percentage difference. So 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and so forth. So you plot it on a logarithmic scale, and then you plot where each mammal is. It follows a perfect line on a logarithmic scale with a 3/4 exponent. Amazing, right? So you tell me the mass of a mammal, I can tell you that mammal's metabolic rate precisely. And I can tell you a bunch of other stuff as well. So that had been known empirically for a long time, but it turns out that Jeffrey West and some of the other colleagues at Santa Fe Institute, Brian Enquist and Brown, came along with a theory to explain that, Jim Brown, so a theory to explain that. And it's actually really cool. And basically the simple version, I think, is energy dissipation in a network, but they really figured out the math and so forth. Jeffrey then extends that work from biological systems to social systems. And we see very similar, there are different mechanisms, but similar patterns for social systems. For example, cities follow these scaling laws. Corporations follow these scaling laws. Not exactly the same mathematical relationship, but also scaling laws. And there's some really, really fascinating sort of research on this and some conjectures as to what those things mean. So, Scale by Jeffrey West. By the way, here's my little cocktail party statistic on that, which I find is really both fascinating and also frightening. If you plot humans on that mass metabolic rate scale, humans should use about 100 watts a day. So, what it takes to sustain your basic metabolic rate, what it takes to sustain you is about what it takes to power a light bulb, right? Mm-hmm. But it turns out that in the United States, I think it's probably true for North America, but in the United States, our average energy usage is 11,000 watts per day. And around the world, it's 3,000 watts per day. So why is it so much higher? Because we've harnessed technology to allow us to deploy much more energy than each of our bodies require. So saying that differently is our energetic footprint is 30x our mass. And so that would be saying instead of having 7 billion people, we have 210 billion people in the world, right? Right. And so the question that's really interesting is, how long will Mother Nature put up with that, right? And will Mother Nature put a stop on that? That's really interesting. And then a third book, by the way, I really like the Ed Thorpe book. I like the first part better than the second part. I really enjoyed Andrew Lowe's book, Adaptive Markets. But maybe the next book I would mention that I thought was interesting was Peter Godfrey-Smith's book called Other Minds. And the book is actually, and he's a philosopher by training, it's really about consciousness. But he does that through the lens of the octopus intelligence. So it's a really, really fun read. You learn a lot about octopuses, but also about the notion of consciousness and sentience and so on and so forth. So that I thought was a really fun book. But I think I don't read as much as you do, but I think I'm around 25 or 30 books for 2017. Those are some of the ones that I found. I mean, there are lots of other ones that I really enjoyed, but those are the ones that come bubble to the surface.
Talk to me a little bit about the Jeffrey West book in terms of taking linear and non-linear thinking. How can we apply that to day-to-day life?
Yeah. So one of the things that Jeffrey and his colleagues found that is really interesting is that for example, cities, that when they broke down some of these relationships, they found sub and superlinear scaling. So what does that mean in plain language? So sublinear scaling basically is an indication of economies of scale. So, for example, if you look at cities of different sizes, as they get larger, they tend to use the physical infrastructure more efficiently. So you need fewer, miles per road per person, or distance of pipes and electric wires and so forth, right? So cities, like larger beings, tend to be more efficient as they get larger. So that's the sublinear scaling, economies of scale. What they also found was superlinear scaling, which is some things grow faster than linear scaling. And those are things that are good, for example, patents. So larger cities tend to be more productive from an intellectual capital point of view than smaller cities. But it also applies to things that are negative, for example, crime and things like that. So I think that these guys are starting to make some headway on understanding these various properties of, and in this case, cities. Corporations, by the way, we're early on in that, but both by the way, for animals, for biological systems as well as social systems, this idea of economies of scale seems to pop up in both particular instances. So the cell of an elephant or a whale is working substantially less hard than the cell of a mouse or a shrew, something like that, which is really they're the same mammalian cell, of course, but they work very differently. So those are interesting ideas. And then Jeffrey, I think that all this work ties back ultimately to things like innovation. And how have we been able to harness so much energy as humans, right? It's mostly via technology, but in a sense, we have to get better and better at innovation in order to sustain the growth that we've been able to achieve over the last few hundred years. And I think there's, like I said, will Mother Nature put up with this? We'll see, but there might be a limit to how much we can continue to grow through innovation, and that would be. I don't think it'll be within our lifetimes we have to worry about anything, but over the next couple hundred years, there might be some challenges. And one of the ways that may manifest, for example, might be something like just a population reset. So in other words, there may be some tragic event, whether it's war or disease propagation or something that resets the human population to a more manageable level. It's a cheery thought.
Yeah. My next question is, what book do you give away the most to other people?
Usually the books that I give away are, it's usually a little trio. C. Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. E.O. Wilson's book, Consilience. And the third book is The Metaphysical Club. So those tend to be the three books that if you said to me, and I usually give those to younger people. They're a 20-year-old kid, those would be the three.
How do you go about reading? Like when you pick up a book, do you read cover to cover? Is there a process? I know there's probably a process well thought out behind this. Like how do you do this?
I say, go to the Farnam Street blog and read the section about how to read a book. No, I think that the Adler stuff is really how you should do it. And I do some of that. I don't do it as systematically as I should. I usually do read things from cover to cover. I will periodically read part of a book and put it down, but for the most part, I try to pick stuff that I like, and I usually will try to get through it from cover to cover. And I don't know if you find this as well. I do find that there tend to be ebbs and flow in my reading pace. So there'll be episodes, weeks where I'll really read a lot. Part of that might be the content that I'm going through. Part of it might just be how my schedule works and so forth. In other weeks where it tends to be much slower, I try to be consistent about doing something all the time, but it does speed up and slow down. And there are certain books where I will just do a sort of a heavy skim to make sure that I have some sense of the content and hopefully can remember if there's something in there that I should refer back to. So I won't read the whole thing. But for the most part, I do read things cover to cover. And sometimes I regret that. But for the most part, I don't mind doing that.
Do you keep all the books after you read them?
I do. It's becoming a sore spot because I don't have any place to put them anymore. So I'm going to probably have to at some point get rid of some of them. And I have books primarily in two places. One is my home office, and one is an office that's outside of my home, a work office. And they both probably have now, 1,500 or 2,000 books. So it's not like a crazy book collection, but probably 3,000 or 4,000 altogether. And I always feel very, very comforted about sitting in the middle of that pile, those shelves, right? Because I always feel like I have access to just a lot of, it's almost like they're friends, but a lot of knowledge and resources. And I always feel great being in the middle of all that. So, and there will be days where if I'm between meetings or I have a few minutes, I just might walk over to a shelf and pull a book off I haven't seen in a while and just flip through it and say, is there any, reacquaint myself with an old friend and say, is there anything in here that I should probably be paying attention to? Because as you know, especially very good books, when you go back to them, with a new point of view, new knowledge, they're gifts that continue to give, right? You can always take something new from them, which is awesome.
How much time do you spend reading new books versus rereading older classics?
Mostly new, probably 90%, 10%. But I can. One caveat to that is that when I am researching, so when I'm writing, almost always that will encompass going back to things and that actually may not just be books, it might be academic articles, but that does require circling back around. So maybe it's higher if you did it that way, but pure like books off the shelf, what am I actually reading? What's on my nightstand? It's going to be 90.
Is there a spot where you read or time of day that you're most comfortable in?
No. Usually evenings at home. We'll do that anywhere, basically, in the house. And then a lot on the weekends. And usually weekends are a fairly simple routine. Part of that, my wife and I have 5 kids. Almost all of them are out of the house. The one that's at home is now in high school. So that creates a lot more flexibility than I know with people with younger kids and so forth. But on weekends, that's a very typical thing for me is to get up on the earlier side of things, come downstairs. It's quiet, make some coffee, and just go at it for a few hours in the morning, and that's great. So it's quiet, it's comfortable. It's the morning. I tend to be more of a morning person than an evening person personally, so that's where I can get a lot of the best reading done. So weekends, big on the weekends, a lot on the weekends. Are
you the type of person who goes to bed early, or just the type of person who rises early?
And I think we may have talked about this before. One of the things that I have become quite religious about is sleeping, and I find it helps me on so many different levels. So I probably go to bed at a pretty normal time and get up at a pretty normal time, but I try to be very religious about 8 hours. For me, 8 hours of sleep a night is really, really good. And there's some nights where I'll sneak by with 7.5 hours. But I really try to be really religious about sleeping, and that just washes over so many other aspects of my life. It affects my exercise, it affects my diet, it affects my productivity, and I just find if I sleep, I can do those things much better than if I don't. So, and I think that's something people I still think. I know there's been a ton written about this, but I still think people don't understand how important it is to sleep, and it's often the case that one less hour doing something else and 1 more hour of sleep, you're going to be much more productive in your other activities.
What have you learned about what contributes to your sleep quality?
It's usually probably very common ingredients, right? Which is I also am a big believer in exercise and moving. So exercise helps a lot. So I will almost always sleep better on nights where I've exercised than the nights where I don't. So the more days I exercise, the better off I'm going to be. Diet's very important too. So try not to eat too much. Try to eat quality stuff. I don't not drink alcohol, but I drink very little alcohol. That also probably helps. So very rarely will I have more than 1 drink in a day, something like that. So those are probably the things that contributed. And I've never had a problem sleeping. But those probably are contributing factors.
Yeah, I would say you've got a firm grasp of what derails most people. Why don't you describe a time that you failed? I'm interested in the situation in which you failed through a personal mistake, and then not only how you recovered and got out of that failure, but how did you go about learning from that failure?
Yeah. Well, probably the episode that I think of as the greatest failure was right when I got out of college. And I was in a training program for an investment bank, which was terrific, by the way, and I learned a lot. And it was a year and a half long. And then that put us into our first jobs. And these we're now called financial advisors, but basically stockbrokers. And so I was given a job as a stockbroker. And this, by the way, was early 1988. The firm I was with, Drexel Burnham, had gone through a bunch of legal issues. It was obviously in the heels of the stock market crash. So the environment may not have been ideal, but I was so ill-suited for that work. And so I gave it a try, but I was miserable, and I was certainly a big failure in doing that job. And essentially, I don't think I formally got fired, but basically got fired, right? Basically, there was a parting of the ways between the firm and me, and that made sense, by the way, on many levels. And so, maybe the silver lining and all that, maybe there are two things that came out of that for me that were really important. The first was that having gone through the training program, and this is why I'm forever grateful for that training program, we were exposed in our program to lots of different parts of the bank, and that allowed anyone who was there to understand sort of where they felt most comfortable, where they felt they could add the most value. So we were on the trading desks, and we were in investment banking, and we were in research and in operations. So, it was a great opportunity to see where you fit, see where your skills and interests would align with what the organization was trying to do. And by the way, from that, I realized the kinds of things that I thought I could be more effective at. And then the second lesson was learning precisely what I'm bad at. Part of it was I'm a natural introvert. That job, I think, was much better suited for an extrovert. I was, in a sense, selling products that I had nothing to do with creating, so I had no real confidence in the underlying products and so forth. So I just learned a lot about what made me uncomfortable, what made me ineffective. And those were lessons that by the way, there were some positive things because they taught you a lot about sales and how to sell things. And some of those lessons I've been able to carry through my life. But so that was a big one. And so then from then I just sort of resolved to find a job or a set of jobs that I thought would suit the kinds of things that I tended to be better at and work toward my strengths. And so usually the advice, I often get called by young people, college students and so forth, and they're saying, what should I do? And so, my first bit of advice is, to the degree to which you can do this, even when you're young, is to take an inventory of what you think you're good at, what you think you're not as good at, what kinds of environments you're comfortable in, where you think you can be productive and what you're not good at, and try to find a career path that sort of gets you on the right trajectory to help you build off your strengths versus build off your weaknesses. So to me, that was my big failure. And, last thing I'll say on that is I used to take the train to go to work. And I remember telling my then girlfriend, now wife, I'd rather ride on this train back and forth from the stations all day than go to work. And I was like, okay, that's probably a good sign that I should not be doing this any longer. So it was a painful period, but a great learning experience.
Yeah, on the notion of advice and kind of following your skills, one of the things that I tell people is to identify what they're really good at that other people are typically really bad at.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And that's a little bit of like Peter Thiel's like how to build a great company, right, kind of thing. It's the same. Yeah, right. Like what problems can you solve that other people can't solve and you're going to be good at? Yeah, no, it's a great way to think about things. Now, when you're young, you often don't have, there's not that much, you really don't have proven skills you can bring to the world, but you can start to think about, do I want to deal with people? Do I want to deal by myself? Or am I more project oriented, or am I want a continuous flow? There are certain, am I a 9-to-5er, or am I someone who needs to be out and about? There are certain sort of dimensions that you can probably think about and at least place yourself somewhere in those dimensions that can be helpful.
Hey, on the notion of Peter Thiel, to steal one of his questions, I mean, like, what is something that you believe that other people don't?
I always find those to be tricky questions, but the one thing that I think that has really changed, one view of mine that's really changed, and it was very much inspired by this work by Judith Rich Harris, is the work on parenting. And as a parent of 5 kids, this obviously is not a non-trivial thing for me. And, I think the argument, I think as parents, we all tend to think that we're really, really pivotal in the lives of our kids. And on some levels, of course, we can be very influential. But I think the argument that Harris makes that's quite compelling is that parents aren't quite as important as they think they are. And there are a lot of studies that I think would contribute to that. Some of these fascinating studies, by the way, of twins, especially identical twins, would suggest that they turn out a lot more similar than different, notwithstanding their very different environments. And that's quite compelling stuff. But I also think the other point that she makes that I've really tried to take to heart and think a lot about in the context of my own kids was the importance of your peer group, especially when you're sort of early teen through kind of high school, it's called that way. So through middle school and high school. And that your peer group's a really important influence on your life in terms of everything, academic achievement, so on. So that's, I think I would have placed much greater emphasis on the role of parents 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And after reading that was something that I really did change my mind on that a lot from that.
What other sort of, possibly counterintuitive strategies do you use as a parent with your kids to either encourage them to think or?
So one of the things that I always try to do, especially when the kids get to a certain age, look, some things for young kids, you're telling them what to do, just, basic things like, go to bed or, bathe yourself or whatever it is. And so that's, you're not going to get around that. But when the kids get a little bit older, for me, I try to be very mindful to give them ideas and ways of thinking, and I call them recommendations. So I say, here's a recommendation for you. Here's a way you might think about this, rather than saying, here's what I think, or here's what you do. And it's been rare that the kids have done something different than what that recommendation is, because obviously I'm trying to illuminate it in a certain way that would make it sensible. But in a sense, it allows them to take ownership of these ideas, right? So I think that's one thing. I say, here's a recommendation for you. Here's a way I might think about that problem. See how that fits you and that suits you, and if that's helpful in your decision-making process. So, and I think this a lot of, there's a book that was also very influential for me. My kids were much younger, called Parent Effectiveness Training, PET. And their basic argument was, as adults, you probably see the answer or a solution faster than your kid does, or you can solve the problem more effectively than your kid does. And especially in our society today, the temptation then is to solve the problem for your kid. And that, of course, leaves the kids without the tools of problem solving on their own. So in that book, they like to distinguish which is your problems that are not the kid's problem, in which case you need the kids to help you solve the problem, and then problems that are the kid's problems, not your problems, in which case you should have them solve them, and you can be the facilitator, right? Helpful, right? And I thought that was a very useful distinction between whose problem am I facing, and as a parent, sort of holding back on this idea that I can solve this problem faster than you, let me deal with it and you don't have to deal with it, right? So essentially teaching the kids how to solve problems, you as an advisor or a guider or a facilitator, rather than doing it on their behalf. So that to me was another thing that I thought was really helpful as a mental model.
I like that a lot. One of the members of our learning community wrote in with a question for you, asking whether you have a recent example of updating your views, maybe cryptocurrency, what to eat, something along those lines.
Oh, updating my views?
Yeah.
Well, I got to say that I don't know if this counts as updating my views, but there's a book, and I don't know if we talked about this, but there's a book I read last year that I thought was really awesome. And it was Ed Young's book called I Contain Multitudes. Do you know that book?
Yeah, I think we talked about that at the retreat last year.
You did? Awesome. So, right. So the work on the microbiome. And so I think that's another area that, I don't know that much about it. I think there's a lot to learn about that. But I have a suspicion that that's probably much more important than most of us probably believe. So I have changed a couple habits as a result of reading that and thinking about that a little bit. The main thing, which I should have done a long, long time ago, but the main thing is I've sworn off any type of soda in any way, shape, or form. No soft drinks, no Diet Coke, no anything like that. And I don't know that this is causal. I should be really clear about that. But from the moment I did that, I found it much easier to maintain a lower weight. I found, I just feel better. So again, that might be all psychosomatic, but it may not be as well. So that may have had an effect on me that I wasn't fully appreciating. So that's a big one. By the way, the stuff on like cryptocurrencies, I don't know. I mean, I've studied a little bit about this, and I suspect many people have, but I'm only watching this mostly out of the corner of my eye. But it's really fascinating, and certainly something like the blockchain, I would imagine, will be a technology that will continue to develop. But whether things like these basic cryptocurrencies, what those mean, and so forth, I don't have a strong view one way or another. It is amazing to watch what's happened the last 4 or 5 years.
Oh, but yeah.
No strong views on that
one. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you that I've never had a chance to ask you, which is, what is happiness to you? What does that mean? What does that word mean? Can you unpack it for me?
Yeah, a lot for me is, ultimately, I've thought a little bit about this, and really for me, it's a sense of, like independence, actually, is probably the word that comes to my mind, which is that I feel like I can do a little bit of what I want, and don't have to worry about too many to be able to do that. What brings me happiness, though, as I get older, certainly come to realize it is about people, and I think everybody emphasizes this, but it's really true. So, I can say that I look forward to nothing greater than being with all my family, because now we have, with all these kids and a couple of them out of college and so forth, it's difficult to bring everybody together. And I look forward to nothing, and I'm no happier than when we have everybody together as a group. And so family, I think, is ultimately the top thing, being with those people. But the sense of independence is this idea that I don't have to worry about, I guess it ties back to this work on scarcity. I don't have to worry about, where anything is going to come from, and having a little bit of financial stability and so forth would be related to that as well. And then I think a lot about, I think this is this idea. It's funny. One of the things I do is play in a sort of beer league hockey group, right? So, so skating, try to get out there and skate once or twice a week, and skating with the guys obviously itself is fun, and that's exercise. But, I've always also come to realize that part of what makes like hockey, this beer league hockey, so interesting is that you're spending essentially, 20 or 30 minutes before the game and 20 or 30 minutes after the game hanging out with these guys, right?
Yeah.
People from all different walks of life and very different day experiences, very different experiences in general, different ages. And there's just a lot to that. By the way, a lot of people saying a lot of zany things, but there's a lot to that, right? In terms of the social processes and so forth that I really value. So, yeah, to me, it's being able to do what you want, having that independence, and ultimately, it's being around people that you want to be around. And the other thing is, I'll say that from an intellectual point of view too, that's the affiliation with SFI has been incredibly valuable in that regard. So I'm usually very happy when I'm there, hanging out with those scientists and talking to people. Again, learning, growing. It's a lot of fun.
I can imagine. I mean, I would love geeking out like that too. So. What's next for you? Are you working on a new book these days?
No, so nothing formal. There are a couple of things that are percolating, and so we'll see if something comes to pass. One of the things that has come up over and over is about a little over a year ago, I wrote a piece I think it was called 30 Years. But basically, I started on Wall Street just a little, now it's 31 years, but a little over 30 years ago. And I try to write down my reflections on what made for a great investor, so the top 10 attributes of a great investor. And that ended up being, very popular. I think for someone like you, Shane, it would be, mom and apple pie, because a lot of the ideas were about decision making and mental models and reading and so forth, and sort of intellectual growth. But that is something that I've been approached numerous times, whether that could be something that would be reasonable to develop into a little book, and it wouldn't be a War and Peace. It could be a relatively short book. And there's some other things. I mean, the other thing I've always been drawn to is this idea of, and it's really at the outset of your question about the Santa Fe Institute, is really, might we be able to, and this would be something probably more like an edited volume, might we be able to draw on, a handful of really great thinkers to talk about the role of complex systems and how it permeates into the world of markets and into the world of business. And that I might be in a decent position to be able to tap those people, to write a little introduction. Something like that would be a project too that I would be inclined to entertain. So nothing in the immediate offing, but a couple of ideas that are percolating. Hopefully, something at some point in the next couple of years will materialize.
Oh, that's awesome, Eve. I'm already waiting with anticipation. This has been great. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, couple areas. One is if you don't follow me on Twitter, I'm certainly on Twitter at MJ Mauboussin is my handle, and michaelmauboussin.com is another website. We don't update it a ton, but there's references to all the books. There are free chapters. There are a couple fun things in there as well. But if you really, and I'm not a hugely active person on Twitter, but I do post stuff from time to time, a few times a week probably. That's probably the best way to keep up a little bit on what I'm working on and what I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been phenomenal.
My pleasure, Shane. Thank you.
Hey guys, this is Shane again. Just a few more things before we wrap up. You can find show notes from today's show at fs.blog/podcast. You can also find out information on how to get a transcript there. And if you'd like to receive a weekly email from me filled with all sorts of brain food, go to fs.blog/newsletter. This newsletter is all the good stuff I found on the web that week, and I've read and shared with close friends, the books I'm reading, and so much more. Last, if you enjoyed this or any other episode of The Knowledge Project, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. Every review helps make the show even better, expand our reach, and share our message with more people, and it only takes a minute. Thank you for listening and being part of the Farnam Street community.